I will talk about the energy sector in Yemen, and we'll focus on a couple of things relating also to the environment and the economy and the conflict. Actually, if we think of the energy sector, I think it's a very good window to understand the complexity of the situation in Yemen today and the power play between the political elites. So the three dimensions, environment, conflict, and economy, come very clearly in this sector. And I will start with the economy. So basically, the energy sector in Yemen has been almost completely dependent on the oil sector, at least the public grid. Things changed during the conflict, and I will get to that in a bit. But Yemen, I mean, generally, if people don't have the background, is an oil producing country, but quite modest compared to its neighbors. So it started its production in the late 80s. It peaked in 2001 with less than 500,000 barrels per day. So it's an important sector for the Yemeni economy, but it's not a very big one compared to the neighbors. There's also some gas production, and it's more recent. In 2013, Yemen produced about 265 billion cubic feet, and the production started around 2009. Now, this has been drastically interrupted by the conflict. But it was also going down, at least for the oil, the crude oil, the production was going down gradually since it peaked in 2001. With the conflict, it almost came to a complete halt for some of the years, especially in 2015. And then it went back into operations, but also on very small scale. When it comes to the electricity sector or the electricity infrastructure, it is very outdated and completely inefficient. It was supplying about 40% of the population pre-conflict. So this was before the conflict. When the conflict started, the sector almost collapsed. And actually, different parts of the country rely on different sources now and different ways of operating the electricity. In some parts, it has been completely privatized, which means that the prices for the electricity are quite high and inaccessible to many segments of the population, but it's available. In some parts, it was also privatized, but subsidized by the government. Which means that the government, the internationally recognized government, has been spending a lot of money subsidizing purchased fuel to the providers of the electricity, who were basically private traders. And the amounts are quite insane. So I think since 2015, there's a figure of about $6 billion have been going into these subsidies and some very basic maintenance. But the infrastructure remains quite outdated, and it seems to be money that is going into the air because it could have gone into upgrading the infrastructure and diversifying the sources towards, for example, solar energy, which is already widely used in the country. In the rural areas, and it's important to note that most of the population lives in rural or semi-rural areas. There is no access to these sources, to these grids, and there has been almost a complete adoption or adapting of solar panels. So this is becoming the primary source for electricity in rural Yemen, and about 70% or more of the households in Yemen depend on or use solar energy in one way or another. We're talking about very small scale, so mini and micro grids, supplying one household or a few households together, and it's not regulated or done by the government in any form. But this makes it quite resilient because it is decentralized. It doesn't depend on public institutions that are already quite weak and dysfunctional. So people are able to cope. And it's quite ironic because pre-war, there was a strategy to shift towards renewable energies by 2025 by a certain percent. But then the war started and people did that out of necessity because there was a serious fuel crisis. And solar energy became the main source. And it is used not only for domestic use, but also for agriculture. Now, this is creating another set of problems because while it helps farmers to pump the water for farming and irrigation, it is depleting already stressed water aquifers. And we see alarming drop in the water aquifer of already, very, very stressed aquifers such as the Sana'a Basin. But we also are getting reports from locals in Shabwa and Hadramaut that it's becoming a worrying trend in terms of extracting water using these solar panels with no regulation. But still, it remains kind of a very important point that Yemen is what they call a sunbelt country, which means that it averages over 8 hours a day of sunshine, and it's quite an ideal place for solar energy. There's also a serious problem here, which has to do with the recycling of the batteries that are used for the panels. And I will come to this in a bit, but this is because it is quite unregulated. No one has really taken this into consideration. We also then, if we move, I mean, this kind of moves us into the discussion about the environment, which is quite connected, because as I said, there is already a very serious water crisis, but there are also other environmental problems, including pollution, environmental degradation, climate change that we are witnessing in the form of extreme weather events, cyclones, and flash floods and droughts. And so on. Now, with the population being quite rural and dependent on two main sectors, agriculture and fisheries, these sectors are very sensitive to environmental degradation and to climate change. And at the same time, we see that the oil sector is directly impacting very sensitive environmental areas, such as the Valley of Hadramaut, which I did research on. And Hadramaut is quite a big province in Yemen, sparsely populated, or not sparsely populated, but compared to other parts of Yemen, it's not very highly populated. And it has a very important and one of the most fertile valleys in the country that extends for hundreds of, or maybe 200 kilometers. So it is a very important source for the population Hadramaut, but also for all of Yemen. Now, what happens in Hadramaut is that most of or a lot of the oil fields are on the plateau. So Hadramaut is surrounded by a plateau, and then the valley, the Hadramaut Valley, goes there, and most people are living in the valley. But there are some mobile Bedouins living on the plateau, and the oil fields are on the plateau. The plateau is an important watershed for the valley. So whenever there's rain, sometimes floods, the water goes through small paths into the valley to feed the farms in the valley. And this is a very intricate system. It has been, there for forever, and people understand it very well and know how to adapt to different floods and different seasons. What happened now, I mean, with the extraction industry on the plateau, is that the geography changed. So there were on the plateau itself, there were some some areas that were operating, they were natural rain harvesting areas. These have been almost destroyed. Also, the Bedouins who were living there, some of them, many of them had to relocate because they could not graze anymore, and there was a lot of restriction in the movement in some of the areas where there is an active oil operation. So in this sense, we can see kind of a very stark contrast between how people are living and the type of infrastructure that they rely on, and the infrastructure of the oil companies on the plateau and around the region. There's also a separation in terms of how people feel that they are, standing on all this wealth of oil, but they are not benefiting from it. So there are multiple reasons for these frustrations, but when it comes to the environment, this is becoming a very concerning issue for anyone, basically, I speak with who lives around that area. But when this conversation comes up beyond Hadramaut and beyond the valley, it's somehow relegated. So there is still a very limited understanding of really the extent of the pollution and the environmental impact of these extractive industries, that basically the residents have to bear the brunt of, with no support from the authorities in terms of even doing the basic cleaning when there is a spill, let alone from the oil companies. So, for example, in one of the major floods in 2008, but also there were other floods that followed, the residents themselves had to go and clean up the spill, because one of the main reasons there is a spill that flows into the water when there is a flood is that the companies, when they do the extraction of the oil, a lot of water comes with the oil. It's called produced water, and this is water that is contaminated by various chemicals used for oil extraction, but also other naturally occurring material that can be toxic. So in some fields, some oil fields, the water cut, or the percentage of water to oil when they extract the oil, is very, very high. It can reach up to 90%, which means that there are millions of barrels of this produced water that some companies re-inject back into the oil reservoir to maintain its level, but this requires high technology that is not really demanded of oil companies in Yemen. Which means that they either re-inject it in other formations on the ground, or they dump it in what is known as open ponds. So sometimes there is a plastic lining, sometimes there isn't, and then the water is dumped there to evaporate. But when there is rain, the rainwater washes the water from these ponds into the valley. And this is also very highly, high in salinity. It results when it goes on crops. It results in the crystallization of some plants because of the high level of salinity. And this is what people have to deal with whenever there are heavy rains, that they need to go and clean the spills and what the residents call black water. They also, when they dig, for surface water, they find that the color of the water has changed, and so on. And this has become a common occurrence in Hadramaut, in the areas close to the oil fields. There have been some community activity and action about this, but it is faced often with a very powerful political elite who shut it down and who, of course, have vested interest. And this brings us to maybe one of the main points about about this nexus of the environment, economy, and conflict when it comes to the energy sector, and that has to do with conflict. So both the energy sector and the electricity are two sectors that are basically epitomes of corruption. There's absolutely no transparency in the contracts offered to oil companies, for example. There's also very high corruption in the electricity sector, and every now and then we hear of reports and scandals about this, because there are really huge amounts of money coming. A lot of it, especially for the electricity sector, is from grants from the regional states, Saudi Arabia and UAE, to support the electricity sector, and it goes into the subsidies that the government, the internationally recognized government, pays to the suppliers of the electricity. So there is a lot of room there for patronage, for sharing some of these royalties, and so on. And this creates actually what some have been calling in Yemen a triangle of power, which are these three governorates that are oil rich and that have been witnessing quite an intense level of competition between political elite, especially after the conflict started and the centralized government collapsed. You had an increased number of new political elites who are competing over fewer and the basically shrinking oil sector with reduced production. So this creates, an array of security problems and other factors that can ignite conflict. It also creates a war economy, black markets, smuggling networks connected to quite powerful figures in Yemeni political scene, and also this is connected with the weapons that are coming into the country and other smuggling activity. So in this sense, we can also understand how the oil infrastructure, or the infrastructure in the oil sector, plays part in this conflict. The infrastructure is quite outdated as well, similar to the infrastructure of the electricity, with some pipes, as old as 35 years and almost no maintenance, so quite rusty. So you have kind of natural leaking sometimes here and there, but also you have there's kind of systematic looting through the pipes, with taps opening, and kind of the looting of oil happening in that way. And this has been, there are indicators that this is not just individual activities for sabotage or for stealing, but it is a systematic looting that is happening under the protection of security apparatus and so on. And of course, this also brings us to an important point, which is this, the complex of the security and militarization within these sectors. So it's not just that the oil sector in particular is very highly securitized. In fact, we have brigades protecting the oil fields, and it's and there's often clashes between the communities and the oil companies for various reasons. And so this is, generally speaking, even before the war, has been always a very securitized sector, but now we have also seen that it is becoming militarized, and it is becoming a very important part of the economic warfare and escalation, with oil exporting ports being directly targeted, especially in 2022. The ports that export oil in Yemen have been basically targeted and have not been operational since then. So this creates quite a complex situation where we have a very outdated infrastructure, we have a dysfunctional government, high competition between conflict parties and militia groups, and competition over smaller and smaller resources, and illicit activity, including smuggling and looting of oil. And we also have this environmental crisis that is happening in the background with very little attention given to it, and very little attention given to the people who are bearing the brunt of this environmental crisis and losing their livelihoods, and also suffering from a very serious public health crisis.